Welcome to Hub Hits. I'm Harrison Lowman, managing editor of the Hub. Well, hate speech laws in Canada might lose their religious belief exemption. That after a deal between the Liberals and Bloc Québécois, so that the governing party can get their legislation passed. Joanna Baron is executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that aims to protect the rights and freedoms of Canadians, and a Hub contributor. And she is here today to help us walk through the particulars. How are you doing today, Joanna?
Great, Harrison. How about you?
I'm good. I'm good. So, currently, the criminal code exempts hateful or anti-Semitic speech if it's based in what is described as good faith on the interpretation of a religious text. It looks like that will be removed, but can you describe for us how this works in the first place? You call it sort of a hate speech escape hatch. What does the hatch look like?
Yeah, so in general, so we're talking about section 319 sub 2 of the criminal code, but from the beginning there's been section 319 3B. So 319 criminalizes expression that is has the tendency to incite hate against an identifiable group. But for reasons maybe we'll get into, there also is an exemption, and it's a clause that protects good faith expression rooted in religious texts. And I think this was seen as just a general, as you say, escape hatch because we don't really want judges and prosecutors to be wading into the business of, what does that, the Bible, all major religions have things that are not exactly kosher, so to speak, in a liberal democratic society. And I think we have an instinct that, like, we don't want to go back and start parsing Leviticus if a pastor starts reciting Leviticus. But from the beginning, the Bloc has had an issue with this, and maybe we'll get into that.
So should this be removed? You're saying that judges will have to sort of become like philosophers and delving into these texts?
I mean, undoubtedly, because they'll have to parse whether the expression is hateful expression and it's just being claimed under a religious guise. There's a good case called Harding from the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2001, where it was, I believe, this was in the 9/11 era, and it was a Christian pastor who was putting out anti-Muslim screeds, and his defense was, "This is part of my sincere good faith religious belief." And the court said, I think properly, you can't just claim that hateful speech. You can't just cloak it in a religious claim and use it as a Trojan horse to bring in hateful expression. So, but where does that line go? Because no doubt there are things that we could quote verbatim from the Siri Guru Granth Sahib or the Torah or the Bible that literally talk about, killing identifiable groups, certain groups and practices being sinful. So all of this is going to get very messy.
We talked about this a little bit before. You said the Hebrew Bible calls for the execution of men who lie with men. Quran contains passages that condemn Jews and Christians as misguided or cursed and condone killing them. The New Testament warns of eternal damnation for unbelievers. So yes, it does get quite complicated. Other countries don't have this. Why? Why do we have this weird policy in the first place?
Well, I think it comes from this Canadian pluralism that we have a thick conception of pluralism, which, like, we really let diverse communities, create their own normative systems. You look at somewhere like France, where a lot of this laïcité that the Bloc is so rabidly into comes from. It's a completely different model, right? Like, if you're part of the République, there's certain things that you explicitly park at the door. But even jurisdictions like the UK and Australia, which is also quite pluralistic, I suspect, I haven't gone through all of the case law, but I suspect that there's a great deal of discretion exercise where the speech in question is religious, but it is a peculiar Canadian compromise. And so a certain part of me, I've been kind of arguing with my team all week about this because I kind of get it, because speech, expressed into the ethers, we live in a basically secular world and hate speech laws apply. It doesn't really matter to me if the person who is speaking hate speech, how they think that they're motivated, how we even parse human motivation. So I really understand the Bloc's motivation that it is an absurd system where if you quote Leviticus, you get one type of treatment, and if you write your own manifesto, you get a different type of treatment, because all of it effectively has the same effects if you accept the premise that hate speech has objectively measurable harms, which is a premise that I think is flawed in many ways.
Yes, there's a wider, question here that you also have your beliefs about. Um, if this is removed, if the amendment is approved, what sort of speech then gets caught up in that removal?
Well, we can see sort of two scenarios. First is that the exemption will be removed, but prosecutors and cops will just exercise discretion, and they'll just say, everybody kind of knows that if you read Leviticus or you read these Psalms or whatever the case may be, you're speaking kind of in parables. Anyways, and it's embedded in our culture. And anyways, the crown will look the other way, which is of course creates its own chilling and instability. It sort of, will hover above religious leaders and make them fearful of, leading sermons even either. But there is another scenario which clearly removing this exemption from the books is inviting, which is that prosecutors don't exercise restraint. And you see pastors being charged for their sermons and imams being charged for quoting the hadiths. And then it will all end up as this huge mess in the courts where judges will have to decide whether that speech is a metaphor, an allegory, liturgy, or indeed a crime. We'll have judges parsing hadiths and psalms in open court. It will be an absurdity. And to me, the kind of dark accelerationist part of me thinks part of that is kind of good, because when we're parsing hate speech laws, in some sense, that's what we're always doing. As I said, we don't even understand how our own free will works. How is a judge after the fact going to parse how somebody was motivated when they said something that was allegedly crossed the line into merely offensive, into hate speech? It's an absurd and unpredictable exercise in and of itself.
Part of me wonders, Joanna, how much of this is just like optics and politics. From the little reading I've done, I haven't seen too often like people using religious texts or their interpretation as a defense, like that actually being parsed out in court. Can you give me a sense of like how often this actually happens in the first place? The Bloc saying, it's completely necessary for us to do this because of the outpouring of hate following October 7th, but like how often is this defense actually used?
Yeah, so on the one hand, it's very rare. I think my colleague Christine Van Gyn found two examples where it was taken up by the court. The one example was this Harding case with this Christian pastor that went up to the Court of Appeal, and his defense was not accepted. I don't recall what the other one is, but the salient touchpoint example that is very much motivating the Bloc, although I should say the Bloc has been on this beat well before October 7th because it is part of their state neutrality doctrine. But the salient example is Adil Charkoui, who of course has led these supposedly pro Gaza, anti-Semitic rallies in Montreal, where he spewed all manner of anti-Semitic verbiage. And in the case of Charkoui, on the one hand, you could say maybe Charkoui thinks that he has a free pass because he will be able to refer to this religious exemption. So maybe there are people who genuinely feel more emboldened to
Emboldened,
spew
yeah.
anti-Semitic rhetoric. On the other hand, in the case of Charkoui, and at least one instance where there were questions about whether he was going to be charged, they didn't end up going ahead with charges, and it had nothing to do with the religious exemption. It was just because the speech was not seen to rise to the level of inciting hate against an identifiable group. You can make of that what you will.
That imam's phrase that people quote was calling for the extermination of Zionist aggressors, I
Right.
think a year or so ago. Just a couple more points. I'm interested in, there's been an outpouring of anger when it comes to those that think this exemption must remain. Pierre Poilievre came out and said that it's an assault on freedom of expression and religion, that it will criminalize sections of the Bible, Quran, Torah, and other sacred texts. The Christian Legal Fellowship coming out and saying These exemptions exist to protect Canadians against the imprisonment for good faith expression of sincerely held belief. And the National Council of Canadian Muslims defending the Bible and saying that this opens the door to a deeply troubling censorship regime. What did you make of the criticism that came out over the last couple days?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, strange bedfellows for sure. But you can understand that this really matters for those who care about pluralism and civil liberties in practice because religious speech is messy, it's metaphorical, it's thousands of years old. It's the DNA of our civilization, and so there's something absurd about a 2025 law going in and trying to parse what an ancient text like the Torah would have to say. It really is the last place criminal law belongs, and giving prosecutors the power to criminalize prayer seems like a category error of the highest order. Criminal law is no joke. It's, the most severe restriction on liberty there is. In terms of constitutionality, we know that in Keegstra, which is the Supreme Court's decision upholding hate speech laws, one of the parts of their reasoning was that because the exemption existed, the effect on freedom of expression could be saved under Section 1. And so many have said that without the exemption, the law on hate speech becomes constitutionally indefensible. Another reason why I think there's a silver lining of this, I just hope that it shows the whole enterprise as being fatally flawed. And I mentioned other jurisdictions like the UK and Australia. Of course, the counterpoint to that is the United States, where there are no hate speech laws, where everything is in. And that, of course, that does not cover violent incitement and, things that can be directly connected to physical violence, even harassment. And I think that's a much cleaner model, to be honest.
Just want your take on the other stuff included in this bill. New offenses around the intimidation and obstruction of sites used by identifiable groups, religious, cultural centers, places of worship, as well as making it a crime to promote hate by displaying hate symbols like a swastika, those linked to terrorist entities. Just your views on the other parts of this bill.
Yeah, I think they're a disaster. I think either they're redundant, because already blocking access to religious spaces is already criminalized. As for displaying symbols, I think either it is lowering the bar for hateful expression because displaying symbols in the context of willfully inciting hate is already criminal law. So this must be reaching at something further and suggesting that merely displaying, the example that of course comes up is a swastika. But what about a hammer and sickle? What about a Confederate flag? And the Justice Minister, Sean Fraser, has already said he's open to, considering all of these other types of symbols, which all have reasons that you might display them for historical reasons or educational reasons. So I think that is a mess, and it's a huge creep into constitutionally protected expression as well.
I'm just picturing a chart where we're going to have to be able, a periodic table of elements chart. We're going to have to be labeling and numbering all these different flags and stuff. Um, Okay, just lastly, and I'll put your political hat on here. I just think it's interesting. The prime minister is a devout Catholic. There was a whole brouhaha since nullified around pre-budgetary examination of removing charitable status for anti-abortion organizations, removing advancement of religion as a recognized charitable purpose. A year or so ago, do we have like a sense of I don't know whether this liberal government views religion differently than the last one. The last one, exploring those things in their pre-budget analysis, but the Carney liberal government and its approach to religion and religious freedoms. Can you fill in the blank in terms of what it looks like so far?
Yeah, I mean, well, they've certainly shown themselves to be willing to sell out their virtue to the Bloc. So clearly, I would say raw political advantage is taking a front seat over principle. I haven't even heard the Liberals give a substantive principled defense of this. I suppose just because it's only been reported over the last few days, but it's just raw political horse trading. And so yeah, it's a grim picture overall.
That is Joanna Baron, Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. For more commentary and analysis on law, politics, culture, business, economics, and everything in between, you can visit www.thehub.ca. ca and maybe even become a paying member so we can keep the lights on here for just $2 a week. Thanks so much for joining us.